down. The smear hits hard until a hot mic catches Mace saying something far worse. Jasmine doesn't flinch. She presents the truth, flips the room and ignites a movement, without ever raising her voice. Within 48 hours, the nation erupts, a hashtag dominates every screen, and Nancy Mace disappears in silence. But in that moment, before the silence, before the storm, what did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped into hearing room 226 of the Rayburn House office building, the air turned cold. Not in temperature, but in tension. The lights buzzed harshly overhead, and camera lenses tracked her like weapons locking on. CNN's red light blinked just beside her face. Across the panel, Nancy Mace sat in the center chair, fingers folded, wearing a smile too sharp to be sincere. Jasmine walked to the witness table with calm, deliberate steps, the kind of calm that comes from knowing you've been targeted before. But today, she wasn't just the target. She was the test. As she sat, her eyes flicked to the microphone. The volume had been lowered, not enough for anyone to admit it, but enough to make her sound faint on live TV. A quiet trick, but a familiar one. Her nameplate read, Representative. Jasmine Crockett, Texas 30, yet the stairs said troublemaker. On the screens above, bold headlines rolled, Race and Federal Spending. Bias in education budgets? Jasmine knew then. This wasn't a hearing. It was a trap dressed as protocol. Every camera was waiting. Every word she spoke would be clipped, twisted, weaponized. Mace tapped the gavel and leaned in. Congresswoman Crockett, you may begin. And please, keep it brief. Polite on the surface. Loaded beneath. Jasmine didn't flinch. She'd sat in rooms like this before, where the rules looked neutral, but the weapons were hidden in smiles. Not today. She adjusted the mic and breathed in slowly. They wanted her rattled. They wanted her loud. She'd give them something else. She had just begun to hit her stride. Jasmine Crockett had her notes arranged, her facts sharp, her voice even. Her tone was calm, professional, but each word was edged with quiet urgency, the kind that couldn't be faked. In fiscal year 2023, she began, eyes scanning the committee, we saw a 23.4% decrease in federal funding to school districts where the student population was over 80% Black or Hispanic. Meanwhile, districts with over 70% white enrollment received an average increase of 11.8%. She turned a page, her fingertips deliberate, her gaze steady. This isn't a math error. This is policy. This is pattern. And it's paid for with opportunities stolen from children who don't look like most of us in this room. A few murmurs stirred, not loud, but enough to feel the temperature shift. In Florida alone, she continued, title and allocations dropped in 10 of the most underserved counties, all majority Black. Meanwhile, the interruption came fast, sharp, like the snap of a brittle branch under boot. We've had enough from loudmouth Democrats like you. Nancy Mace's voice didn't waver. It didn't rise in volume. It landed cold, clear, and calculated. A bullet disguised as a sentence. Everything stopped. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in the way that eyes froze, pens halted mid-stroke, and even the low hum of the air conditioning seemed to retreat. Jasmine didn't flinch, not immediately. Her hands stayed resting on her folder, her expression unchanged for half a second too long. But inside her chest, something sank, then locked into place. She slowly turned her head, eyes narrowing slightly as she fixed her stare on Nancy, unblinking, unreadable. I'm sorry, Jasmine said, her voice low and precise. What did you just say, Madam Chair? Her question wasn't theatrical. It wasn't defensive. It was clinical. She wanted the words repeated, not because she hadn't heard them, but because she wanted the country to hear them again, this time without doubt, without ambiguity. She wanted it on record. Nancy leaned back in her seat, lacing her fingers and offering a smirk that belonged more in a campaign ad than a hearing room. You heard me, Congresswoman, she said. Loudmouth. You people always turn these hearings into emotional soapboxes. Wear it proudly. A gasp rippled somewhere along the back row of aides. Someone's laptop snapped shut. On the high-mounted TV monitors, the CNN feed continued uninterrupted, broadcasting the moment coast to coast. There would be no walking it back, no misquoting, no plausible deniability. Jasmine didn't respond, not with words. Her silence was total, and in it was something unmistakable. Composure forged from too many moments, just like this one. She blinked once. Her lips pressed together, not in retreat, but in refusal. She sat taller, hands folded calmly, refusing to give the room what it wanted. Rage, indignation, meltdown. Because that was the play. That was the setup. That line wasn't spontaneous. It was bait, designed for a viral clip, a talking point, a narrative. Loudmouth Democrat would be the Fox News Chiron by nightfall if she gave them the wrong 10 seconds. They wanted her to raise her voice, to reinforce the stereotype, to become the caricature they'd already written into the script. And so she did the most radical thing she could do. Nothing. The insult still hung in the air, like smoke from a fresh shot fired. But Jasmine didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't rise to meet it. Instead, she reached for something heavier than outrage, truth. Her voice didn't change. It didn't shake or rise. If anything, it became softer, more deliberate, as if what she was about to say couldn't afford to be rushed. His name was Elijah Brooks, Jasmine began, her tone steady as stone. He was 13 years old, 7th grade. He liked sneakers and comic books and science, but the thing teachers wrote about him most in his file was this: talks too much. That's all. Not violent, not disruptive, just loud. Too many questions, too many opinions, too curious. She paused, not for drama, but to let them feel the absurd weight of that sentence. He got written up 5 times in one semester. For speaking, for pushing back when something didn't make sense. There was no movement in the room, just the whir of a camera lens adjusting focus. Jasmine kept going, each word a quiet indictment. He once asked his teacher why they skipped over the part in the textbook about Jim Crow. She told him it wasn't on the test. He asked why the school didn't have Black History Month posters like the other schools in the district. He was told to focus on real academics. They called his mother, told her he was disrespectful. She asked them what he'd done. They said he'd raised his voice. She exhaled just once, not as a release, but as a reset. A month later, he was walking home from school. Hoodie up, backpack on. A robbery had occurred a few blocks away. The description was vague. Black male, teenager, dark clothes. They stopped him. He didn't run. He didn't yell. He just asked why. They said he resisted. They said he reached for something. They tackled him. His head hit the pavement. He was in a coma for 3 days. He died on the 4th. Now, even the side conversations had stopped. Every aide had put their phones down. One congressional staffer swallowed hard. A veteran reporter near the exit lowered his eyes. But Jasmine wasn't telling this story for sympathy. She was telling it because this room needed to be reminded that numbers on paper meant lives in motion. His mother said she used to tell him, "Stop talking so much, Elijah. Stop questioning everything. People don't like loud boys." But he couldn't help it. That was who he was. Loud. Not rude. Not angry. Just loud. She let the word land without apology, without flinch. They called him a disruption. They made him feel like noise. But he was trying to be heard in a system built to ignore him. Then she looked up, eyes calm, voice even, but her presence commanding. He was loud too, but no one listened. A long pause. Just like today. The words didn't just fill the room, they broke it. Not with volume, but with weight. You could feel something shift, like the oxygen had changed. A stillness that wasn't scripted, a silence that no one quite knew how to step out of. Jasmine didn't need to explain the parallel. She didn't have to. The room understood. She'd been labeled loudmouth for daring to question, for refusing to fold into decorum that protected power more than people. Just like Elijah. And that's when it happened. Nancy Mace, still in the chairwoman's seat, still gripping her gavel like a prop, gave a short, sharp breath through her nose. Not a laugh exactly, but something uglier. A dismissive huff. a smirk pulling at the edge of her lips, as if she'd grown tired of the morality play. As if the story of a dead black child was just too inconvenient for the agenda of the day. She rolled her eyes just slightly, but the cameras caught it. Every one of them, in full high definition. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't react. But her stillness in that moment said everything. Because there are moments that don't need rebuttal. Moments when your silence becomes the indictment. When the cruelty of the other person reveals itself more clearly than your defense ever could. And while the room would eventually resume, while the hearing would stumble forward with more questions and more sound bites, that moment, that breathless crack in the mask, would remain. A single casual act of dismissal in the face of a child's death. And it would follow Nancy Mace longer than any vote she ever cast. The silence still hung in the air, like smoke after a strike. But Nancy didn't retreat. She struck harder, this time not with words, but with something colder, more calculated, a weaponized lie dressed as evidence. Nancy Mace tapped her screen with the quiet confidence of someone who'd been waiting for this moment. "Madam Clerk," she said, voice wrapped in false politeness, "please cue up Exhibit C." The room's lights dimmed slightly as the monitors on the chamber walls came alive. For a moment, static. Then, Jasmine Crockett's face. A younger version, standing at a community forum, hand raised, passion in her eyes. But the audio was wrong. Cut. Distorted. Engineered to accuse. "I don't pledge allegiance to a flag that doesn't protect my people." The clip played, ending abruptly. Another cut followed, this one even sharper. "When the police act like fascists, what do you expect me to call them? Heroes." The screen froze there, mid-sentence, mid-expression. Jasmine's face paused at an angle that made her look almost unhinged. The silence in the room was immediate, and then it broke. Not into conversation, but into reaction. Gasps. A low theatrical whistle from one of the Republican aides in the second row. A congressman leaned forward with both elbows on the table, shaking his head like a disappointed father. Someone muttered, "Unbelievable," just loud enough for a nearby mic to catch. Nancy Mace didn't need to say anything else. She leaned back in her chair, smug, and watched the oxygen drain from the room like a magician waiting for applause. And then the cameras moved. Like trained predators, they all swiveled to Jasmine. Not to Mace, not to the source of the clip, but to the woman in the crosshairs. Every lens locked on her face, hoping for the crack, the outrage, the snap. Because this was never about truth, it was about the reaction. And the narrative had been set before Jasmine even walked into the room. All that was left now was for her to prove it. But she didn't. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't even blink. Because this wasn't the first time she'd watched her voice get stolen, spliced apart, rearranged like puzzle pieces meant to build a lie. She knew the full sentence. "I don't pledge blind allegiance to a flag that doesn't yet protect all of my people, but I believe in fighting to make it worthy of that pledge." That truth had been amputated, edited out. What remained was a soundbite made for smear ads and social media firestorms. The injustice didn't lie in what they showed. It lay in what they didn't. It was the surgical cruelty of omission. And the people in that room, they weren't shocked because they believed it. They were shocked because they wanted to. Jasmine's eyes scanned the panel slowly, taking in each face. Some looked down, some smirked. One Republican congresswoman pretended to shuffle papers, as if pretending not to witness was the same as not being complicit. Jasmine recognized every tactic, because none of this was about debate. It was about erasure, a performance meant to shrink her, to drown out a woman who had already been told 1,000 times in 1,000 ways that she was too much. But they had made a mistake, because this version of Jasmine, the one seated beneath that screen, surrounded by hostility and half-truths, wasn't built to shatter. She was built to absorb, to endure, and more importantly, to remember. The image still hung frozen behind her, a moment mutilated and repurposed, while the room waited for her to protest. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She requested justice. Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver. It didn't need to. The steel was in the restraint. "Madam Chair," Jasmine said, turning slightly to face Nancy Mace directly. I formally request that the full, unedited video be played for the record. Her words were calm, but they carried the unmistakable weight of someone refusing to be buried by a lie. That clip was manipulated. It omits context. It misleads this committee, and it misrepresents both the facts and my character. She paused, let it sit. If this body claims to care about truth, then we should start by letting it speak in full. The room didn't breathe. Nancy Mace's lips curled into something between a smirk and a refusal. She didn't look at Jasmine. She looked past her, down at her folder, as if the request hadn't been made at all. Then, like someone swatting away a gnat, she replied, "The committee has already seen the relevant portion. We'll proceed." The dismissal was surgical, polished in tone but brutal in intent. Jasmine had laid down a demand for fairness, and it had been stepped over like a crack in the floor. That was the moment the injustice crystallized. Not just in what had been said, but in what had been refused. The right to context, the right to accuracy, the right to defend the truth in front of a nation watching live. It wasn't just disrespect. It was systemic choreography, rehearsed erasure disguised as official process. But Jasmine didn't push. She didn't beg. She just stared back at the chairwoman, the kind of stare that says, "I've survived worse than you hiding behind protocol." And then a voice, clear and unexpected, rose from the other end of the panel. "Madam Chair," said Representative Alan Whitaker, an older congressman unaffiliated with either political extreme, known more for paperwork than passion. He leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "In the interest of accuracy, and given the gravity of the implication made against the witness, I respectfully move that this committee recess for 10 minutes to allow a full review of the unedited recording." The sentence landed like a crack through glass. A shift rippled across the room, not seismic but unmistakable. Nancy blinked, her fingers tightening slightly around the base of her gavel. "There's no need for that," she said, but her voice had lost its earlier certainty. She added, "This isn't a courtroom." But the justification rang thin, defensive. The cameras had caught it, not just the denial, but the shift. The tension that followed wasn't chaos, it was clarity. That a neutral voice had spoken up made it harder to dismiss. That the request had come from someone who'd never sided with Jasmine before made it impossible to ignore. What Jasmine had been denied out of prejudice, another had demanded out of principle. It didn't repair the injustice, but it exposed it. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't gloat. She didn't even exhale. She simply adjusted her papers, eyes forward, posture composed. She had asked for one thing, truth. And when that door was slammed, she stood in the gap. Now someone else had cracked it open. The clock hadn't stopped. But now the next 10 minutes weren't just a pause. They were the calm before a reversal, a quiet countdown to what happens when the full story finally gets its turn. The gavel may have struck pause, but the damage had already been done. And Jasmine knew, if she didn't move quickly, the lie would calcify into history. As the room slowly emptied for the 10-minute recess, a swarm of reporters rushed out like bloodhounds catching a scent. Lawmakers filtered into side rooms, some chuckling, others whispering, but Jasmine remained seated. Her hands moved with a quiet confidence, not theatrical, just precise. From the leather pouch stitched into the back of her folder, she withdrew a black USB drive and slipped it into her laptop. The screen came alive with a full-length video, untouched, unedited, hers. Her voice rang out in its original clarity, unchopped, unpoisoned. "I don't pledge blind allegiance to a flag until it protects all of us equally. But I fight to make it worthy of that pledge." There it was, the full truth. The part they'd cut out because the truth didn't fit their narrative. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She fast-forwarded, marked exact timestamps. Her fingers moved fast, her expression unreadable. She wasn't watching the video. She was loading a weapon, a quiet one made of context and code. Beside her, the soft click of shoes against marble stopped at her table. A senior aide bent low, voice tight with urgency. "We analyzed the clip they played. It's worse than we thought." He handed her a printed spectrogram, lines of color mapping vocal frequency like a digital fingerprint. "They ran your voice through compression, made you sound harsher, There's a waveform spike at 017. Unnatural. They isolated a breath and boosted it to sound like you snapped. Jasmine took the page. Her eyes scanned it. Not once did her posture shift. Is it enough to prove tampering? She asked. The aide nodded. It's definitive. She slid the paper beside her laptop, added the full clip onto a backup flash drive, and sealed it in a labeled envelope. Get this to the committee clerk before the recess ends, she said. No drama, just chain of custody. Every word measured. She wasn't angry, she was exact. She knew the game. If you sound outraged, they say you're unstable. If you stay calm, they say you're rehearsed. So instead, let the evidence speak. Outside the chamber, the narrative had already started to crack. A reporter from the Hill posted a screenshot of the video timeline, writing, "There's a hard jump at 14 seconds. Where's the rest of the clip?" MSNBC had begun scrolling a banner that read, "Edit or smear." Questions surround hearing footage. Twitter lit up with side-by-side comparisons. One labeled what they played, the other what she actually said. The momentum was shifting, fast. Not because Jasmine had shouted, but because she hadn't. She'd let them overplay their hand, and now the press could smell blood. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had been silenced mid-sentence. Now the nation was hearing her in full, because they'd tried to bury her truth and missed a corner sticking out. That's the thing about evidence. It doesn't go away when you lie about it. It waits. And Jasmine? She was done waiting. When the 10-minute recess ended, the lawmakers returned to their seats. But the silence that followed wasn't procedural. It was the quiet that comes when the air itself knows something irreversible is about to unfold. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of a room that no longer saw her as a target, but as a question it hadn't been prepared to answer. Her laptop was already connected to the committee display. The screen in the chamber blinked to life with a single frame. Her face, calm, mid-sentence. Not the distorted freeze frame that had been used against her earlier, but one rooted in clarity. She didn't clear her throat. She didn't preface. She simply looked up and spoke with quiet certainty. Madam Chair, members of this committee, I request the following be entered into the record. The original, unedited footage you were not shown, and the technical breakdown confirming its manipulation. There were no objections this time. Permission wasn't granted so much as silently conceded. The room dimmed. The video began. Her voice filled the chamber. Not the clipped, hostile echo that had been weaponized earlier, but the full sentence, smooth and deliberate. I don't pledge blind allegiance to a flag that doesn't yet protect all of us equally, but I believe in fighting to make it worthy of that pledge. There it was, the missing half, the heart of what had been hidden. Then the next section played, the part where she had been accused of calling police fascists. Only now the actual line rang out, firm, constitutional, impossible to twist. When law enforcement steps outside the Constitution, they must be held accountable. That isn't anti-police. That's pro-democracy. No anger, no disrespect, just truth, stripped of its armor by the edit, and now restored to full voice. The screen then split in two. On one side, the doctored version played again, the chopped phrases and flattened tone arranged like a trap. On the other, the original. Below them, Jasmine clicked once more and brought up a waveform analysis, the audio map glowing in lines of blue, red, and gold. She stepped slightly to the side, letting the evidence speak. This spike, she said, pointing to a jagged red line, was not my voice. It was digitally altered, compressed and elevated to heighten emotional tone. That is not an opinion. It is forensic fact. I have submitted the acoustic analysis, signed by 2 independent experts, to the clerk. She paused, letting her words settle like ash. What this committee was shown earlier was not just edited, it was engineered. A staffer shifted uncomfortably behind the dais. One Republican congressman cleared his throat but said nothing. The Democratic members sat frozen, some in disbelief, others in quiet rage. At the end of the row, Representative Whitaker, the moderate who had requested the recess, watched Jasmine the way one watches a fire they didn't expect to grow this fast. But Nancy Mace said nothing. She didn't rebut. She didn't even raise her head. Her fingers drummed once against the polished desk, then stopped. No denial, no apology, just stillness. Jasmine turned back to face the full committee now. Her eyes didn't scan for support. She wasn't looking to be rescued. She was naming what they'd tried to erase. "This wasn't a mistake," she said, voice low but steady. "It was a decision. Someone chose to strip context from my words and feed it to the public as fact. Someone decided that integrity was less important than narrative, and someone hoped I wouldn't have the receipts." The silence was complete now, not out of shock, but out of recognition. The room knew. The cameras knew. The country would know within minutes. Jasmine stepped back from the mic, her hands still at her sides, her expression unchanged. But for the first time all morning, the power in the room had clearly, irrevocably shifted. Not because she raised her voice, but because she refused to let them define it for her. And behind her, the full video continued to play. Truth uninterrupted. The truth had already landed. Clean, undeniable, devastating. The doctored clip had been dismantled, the room silenced, and Jasmine's name restored. But for some, nothing stings like being exposed in front of a camera. And in that silence, Nancy Mace snapped. It began with a twitch, a shift in Nancy's fingers, drumming the desk harder than necessary. Her smile, forced in frozen moments earlier, now looked brittle, almost painful. As Jasmine stood at the center of the chamber, her facts laid bare and her evidence untouched, the chairwoman's restraint buckled under the weight of her own failure. The moment had slipped out of her hands and she knew it. "Enough," Nancy muttered, but the mic caught it. She didn't look up. She shuffled a paper she didn't need to read. And then, louder, sharper, "We've heard enough of this morality theater." Jasmine turned her head slightly, not dramatically, not with provocation, just enough to acknowledge what had been said, enough to signal, "You want to go on record? Go ahead." Nancy's voice cracked through the room before anyone could stop her. "You people always play the victim." The words landed like broken glass hurled against marble, jarring, sharp, impossible to pretend away. A few lawmakers visibly stiffened. An aide dropped their pen. Another leaned forward, brow creased, like they hadn't just heard what they'd heard. But Nancy wasn't done. The crack had widened. "Loudmouths, monkeys in suits." Silence. Not the ordinary kind, the kind that wraps a room in a second skin. A suffocating, freezing stillness that tells you history has just been made, and not the kind people will be proud of. It wasn't just the racism, it was the carelessness of it, the comfort, the fact that it hadn't slipped from her mouth in a moment of chaos, but had been sitting there, coiled like a snake waiting to strike. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't step back. She didn't shout. She didn't look at the cameras, though every lens had swung violently in her direction. She took a single breath. Then, without raising her voice, she said, "Say that again." For the record, it wasn't a request. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a command. The kind of sentence that echoes. The kind that demands accountability without theatrics. Every head turned to Mace. The temperature in the room dropped. Someone on the left side of the chamber muttered a curse under their breath. A Democratic congressman's mouth hung slightly open. A Republican woman on the committee pulled out her phone, not to scroll, but to start recording, because everyone in that room knew what had just happened. There are things you can walk back in Washington, a failed vote, a political flip-flop, even a lie if it's the right kind. But this wasn't spin. This was naked, and the woman who said it sat in the chair reserved for judgment. Jasmine stood perfectly still. Her hands rested gently on the table in front of her. Her shoulders didn't shift. Her eyes stayed locked on Nancy, not with rage, but with something deeper, clarity. And through that stillness, the truth radiated. This wasn't just a slip of the tongue. This wasn't about tension or pressure. This was the mask falling. Nancy's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes darted to the press gallery, where every journalist was already mid-keystroke. Someone at CNN was pulling their earpiece out to scream into a producer's mic. Twitter had already caught fire. There would be transcripts. There would be footage. There would be no walking this one back. The room remained frozen. Jasmine didn't fill the silence. She didn't need to. Nancy had done all the talking, and the country had listened. What had started as a calculated effort to discredit Jasmine had become a case study in the very bias she had come here to fight. It was raw, it was exposed, and it was hers to hold, not as a burden, but as proof. Proof of what happens when you refuse to be quiet. Proof of what happens when you don't flinch, even as someone tries to reduce you, not with argument, but with dehumanization. And Jasmine Crockett, a woman accused all day of being too loud, had answered the loudest slur of them all with a whisper. Say it again, for the record. The power in that sentence wasn't just in the words. It was in the control, in the refusal to meet hate with hate, in the decision to let the silence speak louder than fury. Because what Jasmine knew, what the entire room now understood, is that there is no better witness than the moment someone shows you exactly who they are. And Nancy Mace had just sworn herself in. No rebuttal, no recovery, just the raw sound of a career cracking open beneath the weight of its own cruelty. And Jasmine, she stood untouched, not because she hadn't been hit, but because she'd been through worse, and they hadn't silenced her then either. Jasmine didn't need Nancy to repeat it. The room had heard it. The country had felt it. But what none of them realized yet, what Jasmine already suspected, was that every second had been caught on the room's hot mic. The moment stretched long, thick with unspoken tension. Then near the back of the chamber, a man stood up slowly. He wore no congressional pin. His badge read House Technical Support, and his hand trembled slightly as he raised it. Madam Chair, he said, voice taut, for the record, I must confirm that the microphones in this chamber remain active during all sessions unless manually deactivated. Nancy didn't react. She stared blankly ahead, as though the words hadn't registered. But Jasmine turned to the man, not with surprise, but with something closer to quiet affirmation. She'd felt it. Every fiber of her understood the system well enough to know it always leaves behind a trail. And this time, the wire hadn't gone dead. The tech continued, now reading from a device clutched to his chest. There's an onboard archival system that stores all live audio on a rolling buffer. The phrase in question, "You people always play the victim, monkeys in suits," was captured at timestamp 10:42:33. The room broke open with a low gasp, audible, measured, irrevocable. It was no longer a matter of denial or spin. It was on record. And Jasmine, still unmoved, turned slightly and said, "Then I move that the committee replay the archived audio for full verification." There was no vote. There didn't need to be. The room went dark for just a second, the screens reconfiguring. A faint buzz from the overhead speakers signaled the playback feed was live. Then it came, static, low at first, then Nancy's voice. Crisp, unmistakable. "You people always play the victim." Click. Loudmouths. Click. Monkeys in suits. No edits. No debate. Just raw audio, playing back like a confession under fluorescent light. Nancy's head dropped into her hands. For a few seconds no one moved. No one exhaled. It wasn't outrage now. It was recognition. Recognition of the line that had been crossed. The kind that doesn't blur with party lines or clever talking points. The kind that echoes through institutions like a fracture in marble. Every person in that room knew it. This wasn't just offensive. It was historic, ugly, public. A rustle cut through the silence. It was Representative Valdez, a Democrat from California, standing and gathering his folder. "With respect, I refuse to sit at a table where that language is allowed to stand," he said. He turned, walked straight down the aisle, and left. His aide followed. Within seconds, others rose too. Representative Lamar from Massachusetts, then Rivers from Illinois. And to the quiet astonishment of half the chamber, Representative Dean, a moderate Republican from Pennsylvania, stood as well. "This goes beyond partisanship," he muttered. "This is rot." It didn't take long. The exodus wasn't dramatic. It was coordinated. A quiet, measured rejection that carried more weight than shouting ever could. One by one, members left their chairs empty, crossing behind Jasmine with silent nods, acknowledging not just her composure, but the fact that she had stood her ground while the system cracked around her. Nancy still hadn't moved. Her knuckles were white on the desk. The gavel lay untouched beside her, useless now. She had no command left. Only eyes on her, millions of them. From the press gallery, from the live stream, from social media feeds already catching fire. On screen, a trending bar climbed upward like a rocket. Resign Mace. Then say it again. Then monkeys in suits. It was over. Not in the legal sense. Not yet. But in the moral court of public consciousness, the verdict had been delivered. Jasmine remained seated. She hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to grandstand. She had simply held the line and let the truth arrive on its own frequency. Now that it had, she didn't feel victorious. She felt exhausted, not visibly, not in posture, but somewhere deeper, beneath the practiced control that every Black woman in power learns to armor herself with. And then came the final blow. A page walked swiftly into the room, delivering a folded memo directly to the clerk. It bore the seal of the Speaker of the House. The clerk read it, eyes widening, and turned to the committee mic. This hearing is suspended, effective immediately. The office of the Speaker has requested a formal review of Chairwoman Mace's conduct. The room tensed, but only briefly. It wasn't shock anymore. It was inevitability. Nancy finally raised her head. Her eyes were glassy, not from regret, but from the realization that there would be no cleanup, no clever press release, no panel of allies spinning this into a misunderstanding. What she'd said, what she chose to say, was now part of the congressional record, a stain on more than just her name. It would follow her across every screen, every newsroom, every whispered hallway conversation for the rest of her political life. And Jasmine? She stood, not rushed, not theatrical. She gathered her notes with care, slid the USB back into its pouch, and turned to leave. But as she passed the witness table, she paused, looked at the chair, at Nancy, and said only this. "You didn't just insult me, you confirmed why I'm here." Then she walked out. Behind her, the room remained frozen, one woman carrying the weight of truth, and another crumbling beneath the weight of her own words. As Jasmine stepped past the stunned faces and into the corridor, the chamber behind her still trembling from the impact of truth, one final figure entered, unannounced, unhurried, and carrying the full weight of institutional reckoning. The double doors creaked open, not with drama, but with finality, the kind of hush that falls when the last person with real authority enters the room. It was Chairman Bradford Ellis, veteran congressman, long respected for his neutrality and rarely seen outside of his usual committee circuit. His arrival was not scheduled. It wasn't expected, which made it all the more devastating. He walked in slowly, eyes sharp beneath silver brows, and paused just inside the chamber. No aides flanked him. No press knew he was coming. He stood for a full breath, surveying what remained, a committee room half empty, a dais chairwoman reduced to silence, and a floor that still echoed with the fallout of her words. Then he moved. With deliberate steps, he crossed to the center, bypassing formalities, microphones, and any illusion of routine. "This committee," he said without raising his voice, "is now under interim oversight." His tone cut clean, like polished marble cracking. Effective immediately, Chairwoman Nancy Mace's authority to preside over this hearing is suspended pending formal review by the Ethics Committee. Nancy didn't look up. The words landed like a verdict without a jury. No one in the room spoke. Even the stenographer stopped typing, fingers hovering over keys as if unsure whether to mark the moment or leave it untouched. Chairman Ellis nodded once toward the clerk, who solemnly closed the session folder in front of her. "I will assume facilitation of remaining proceedings," he added, "and I will allow one final statement, should the witness wish to speak." The cameras flicked back on with a soft, mechanical whir. Microphones lit green again. But the moment wasn't about technology. It was about choice, about whether Jasmine Crockett, after everything, still had something left to say. She did. Jasmine turned just slightly from her place near the exit. She stepped back toward the table, not because she needed a stage, but because she understood the weight of endings, of leaving something not just finished, but understood. She stood behind the microphone, no papers in hand, no notes to reference, just the moment. Just the truth. When I walked into this room, she began, her voice calm and steady, I knew the odds. I knew the narrative that would be waiting for me. Angry, emotional, loud. She paused, not for effect, but for gravity. And I knew there would be some who would rather cut my words than confront them, who would distort my voice because they couldn't dismiss what it was saying. She looked straight ahead, not at Mace, not at the cameras, but at the seats themselves, at the institution. But let me make something clear, she said, her voice rising, not in volume, but in clarity. You didn't hear me speak loudly today because I'm unruly, or unprofessional, or playing some part. You heard me speak clearly because silence has never saved people like me, and I didn't come here to be palatable. I came here to be truthful. Behind her, the full transcript of the doctored clip and the waveform analysis had been projected onto the side screen. A few remaining staffers glanced up at it, faces tense. She continued. You called me loud, Jasmine said, her tone now firmer, her stance square. You called me theatrical. You tried to paint my voice as a weapon instead of a warning. But the only thing I've ever raised is the volume of truth in rooms that would rather hear echoes. Then she paused, just long enough to let the weight settle. You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore. And that was it. She didn't linger. She didn't look to the chairman for approval. She simply stepped back, unplugged her laptop, and tucked the folder of evidence, now stained by the weight of history, under her arm. No one moved. No one tried to clap. Because applause would have cheapened it. This wasn't victory. It was exposure. It was what justice sounds like when it finally finds a mic and refuses to hand it back. Chairman Ellis bowed his head once in acknowledgement. Not approval, not admiration, just recognition of the line that had been crossed, and the woman who had crossed it standing. As Jasmine Crockett exited room 226 for the final time that day, the silence that followed was not the silence of defeat. It was the kind that remains when something irreversible has been said out loud, and no one can unhear it. Behind her, on the committee monitors, the last line of the closed caption transcript still glowed. You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore. No one turned the screen off. They let it stay, let it burn, let it echo, because they all knew. History doesn't whisper when it walks out the door. It leaves the door open. By the time Jasmine Crockett stepped off the Capitol steps and into the overcast afternoon, the world outside the hearing room had already changed, and it hadn't waited for permission. The news alerts came fast. At 3:47 p.m., the Washington Post updated their headline from Crockett accused of anti-American remarks to unedited footage reveals edited smear against Representative Crockett. At 3:52, MSNBC ran a breaking banner. Crockett clip was doctored. Ethics panel reviews Chairwoman Mace's conduct. By 4:05 p.m., CNN anchor Dana Reese opened her live broadcast with a tone rarely heard from her, measured but reverent. What began as an attempt to discredit a congresswoman ended with a moment that has now been described as one of the most dignified and devastating rebuttals ever caught live on Capitol Hill. It wasn't spin, it wasn't damage control, it was the oxygen of a new narrative catching fire. Clips of Jasmine's closing words flooded every platform. On Twitter, her line, "You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore," was captioned, stitched, and quote tweeted by journalists, celebrities, veterans, teachers, teenagers. Side-by-side edits of Jasmine's calm against Nancy Mace's eruption turned into 10-second TikToks that played like courtroom dramas. But this wasn't fiction. This was real. And people didn't just watch it. They felt it. By sundown, a new hashtag emerged. Loud for Justice. It wasn't just a slogan. It was a declaration, a reclamation. It started when a 15-year-old high schooler from Atlanta posted a 30-second video on TikTok. She stood in her school bathroom, uniform slightly wrinkled, her phone propped up on a folded paper towel. She spoke into the lens with a trembling voice that didn't quite crack. I used to be afraid to raise my hand. I was afraid they'd say I was too loud, too much. But today I saw someone who looked like me not back down. Now I speak louder. Thanks, Representative Crockett. Within an hour, her video had 4.2 million views. By morning, it had 12.8. Teachers began using the footage in classrooms, not as a civics lesson, but as a case study in dignity. University students played Jasmine's words over protest montages. A law school professor at Howard uploaded a thread breaking down Jasmine's composure as a masterclass in strategic restraint under racial pressure. Hashtags gave way to headlines, and headlines gave way to history. One op-ed in The Atlantic read, "In one of the most hostile environments a black woman can enter, a live congressional hearing, Jasmine Crockett didn't just survive a racialized ambush, she transformed it into an indictment of the culture that built the ambush in the first place." But the most powerful shift wasn't on television, it was in absence. By the second evening, Nancy Mace's press team canceled all scheduled appearances. No statement, no press release, not even a denial. The Twitter account that once fired out policy barbs every 30 minutes went dark. News outlets requested interviews. None were granted. Fox News, where she had once been a regular fixture, refused to comment on whether she'd return. Her office door, usually wide open for cameras, remained shut. And for the first time since she'd entered Congress, Nancy Mace had gone silent. The irony was so sharp it barely needed to be said. The woman who had mocked another for speaking, who had laughed at her voice, cut her mic, twisted her words, and labeled her a loudmouth, was now hiding behind the very silence she once demanded from someone else. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett didn't host a press conference. She didn't go on morning shows. She didn't write a victory tweet. She just went back to her office, answered constituent letters, and met with an education equity group from Detroit. When asked by reporters if she planned to take further action against Mace, she offered only a short reply. "Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it just looks like exposure." And that was the final blow, because what Nancy Mace had tried to do wasn't just political, it was structural. It was the slow, strategic unraveling of someone's credibility based on tone, volume, identity. And Jasmine had responded not with outrage, but with evidence, with patience, with composure. And in doing so, she'd pulled back the curtain not just on a woman, but on a machine. By day 3, a special ethics panel had been convened. By day 5, the New York Times editorial board called for Mace's resignation. Her language, her manipulation of evidence, and her refusal to apologize make her position as committee chair untenable. And yet Jasmine Crockett remained largely out of sight, because she didn't need to speak anymore. The country was speaking for her. At rallies in St. Louis, Los Angeles, and Baltimore, crowds held up signs that read, "Loud isn't rude, loud is resistance." She spoke for me. #loud for justice. And in Washington, a plaque was quietly requested by staff to be placed in Committee Room 226. Just 6 words engraved on polished brass. "You called me loud. I called it justice." No ceremony, no unveiling, just truth, left there to echo long after the shouting stopped. It didn't end when Jasmine Crockett walked out of the hearing room. In fact, that's when it really began. The clip of her final words had already traveled through 1,000 timelines and inboxes before she reached her car. By the next morning, it was being broadcast not just on political talk shows, but across classrooms, community centers, and living rooms where justice had long been a distant headline. For millions of Americans, it wasn't just that Jasmine had spoken, it was how she spoke, with restraint, with control, with fire wrapped in dignity, and without giving them what they wanted, a black woman shouting, unraveling, giving them something easy to dismiss. In Harlem, a group of high school seniors paused their standardized test prep to discuss her words instead. One teacher put down the math workbook and played the full exchange on a projector. When it ended, a student raised his hand and said, "She sounded like my mom when she's had enough, but won't let them see her sweat." Everyone in the room nodded. They knew that tone. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was survival strategy turned into public art. In Oakland, a muralist painted Jasmine's silhouette towering over a city skyline, one hand raised not in anger, but in assertion. Across her shoulder read the words, "Loud is when truth refuses to whisper." On the Senate floor, 2 members, one Democrat, one independent, publicly cited her moment as a model of constitutional courage under racial pressure. For a place notorious for posturing and doublespeak, their praise was almost intimate. It wasn't just about her performance. It was about the tectonic truth it forced the country to confront. But it wasn't only adults watching. A 15-year-old girl in Atlanta filmed a TikTok from her school bathroom. The tiles dull, the lighting harsh, the message unforgettable. Her voice trembled as she stared into the camera and said, "I used to be afraid to raise my hand. I was scared they'd say I was too loud, too dramatic, too black. But after yesterday, I'm done whispering. Thanks, Representative Crockett." She hit upload. 12 hours later, the video had 6 million views. Teachers stitched it. Authors reshared it. By the end of the week, it was being played at youth summits, college forums, and Sunday services across the South. The hashtag that had started as a flicker, #Loud for Justice, now roared. It climbed to the top of global trends within 48 hours, not as an algorithm trick, but as an anthem. People weren't just reposting Jasmine's video. They were adding their own voices. A nurse in Detroit uploaded a video saying, "They called me too aggressive for asking for pain meds for my patient, but now I'm loud for justice." A bus driver in Baltimore stood in front of her rearview mirror and whispered, "I speak now. I'm loud now. I'm not sorry anymore." It wasn't a movement built on slogans. It was built on relief that someone had finally named the manipulation out loud and done it on live television in front of the very people who usually got to edit the story. Jasmine hadn't just won a moment. She had restored ownership to a voice that had been twisted, softened, erased for centuries. But perhaps the most powerful echo came from those who never planned to speak at all. In Houston, a 64-year-old grandmother named Clarice Campbell recorded her very first social media post. Sitting at her kitchen table, holding her rosary, she looked straight into the lens and said, "I marched in 1968. I saw us fight for the right to vote, to speak, to sit at the table. But today I saw something new. I saw my granddaughter's eyes light up. She said, 'She talks like you, Nana.' And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel tired. I felt heard." What Jasmine had done wasn't explosive. It was enduring. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't stormed out. She hadn't flipped the table. She'd stood still. Let the facts speak. Let the system indict itself. And in doing so, she gave people something most of them didn't even realize they were starving for. An example. An example that you can be both angry and elegant. That you can be wounded and still wield truth like a weapon. That you don't need to raise your voice to make the room shake. And that when someone tells you to be silent, the most radical thing you can do is keep speaking anyway. The hearing room was now quiet. The chair where Nancy Mace once presided sat empty. Her name hadn't been mentioned in over a week. And that too was fitting. Because the woman who once demanded that Jasmine be silent had now vanished into the very quiet she once used as a weapon. And Jasmine, she hadn't disappeared. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't needed to. Because the echo didn't come from her mouth anymore. It was coming from everywhere else. The cameras eventually turned away. The headlines moved on as they always do, replaced by new chaos and another scandal, louder fireworks. The story that had once gripped the nation faded from the front pages, but not from the people who'd felt it, because something stayed. Weeks after the hearing, when the frenzy had cooled and Capitol Hill returned to its usual rhythm of noise and forgetting, Jasmine Crockett didn't chase the spotlight. She didn't book a press tour. She didn't write a memoir. She did what she'd always done, returned to her district, returned to the people who sent her there in the first place. But something was different now. At her first town hall back in Dallas, the line wrapped around the building, not for handshakes, not for selfies, but to speak. Elderly veterans in pressed suits, teenagers with notebooks, young mothers balancing babies on their hips. They came not to ask her questions, but to tell her what her silence in that hearing had said to them. "You didn't yell," one young woman said, voice shaking as she stood up in the back row. And still the room broke apart. A teacher nodded beside her. "You didn't match her hate. You made it undeniable." A man in his 70s, civil rights era, eyes heavy with memory, took Jasmine's hand afterward and whispered, "You didn't just hold your ground. You changed the shape of it." Outside the media machine, where narratives are spun and unspun daily, something else had begun to form. Quiet, steady, real. A legacy. At Howard University, a constitutional law professor began assigning Jasmine's hearing testimony as required reading. Not for her policy points, but for her discipline, her poise under pressure, her refusal to let a room built to erase her define her. In a classroom full of black women studying law, the professor played the moment Jasmine said, "Say that again, for the record," and paused the video. "That," she said, "is what power sounds like when it isn't begging for permission." At Spelman, a graduate writing seminar hosted a panel called Voices That Refuse to Flinch. One of the speakers, a poet and activist, called Jasmine's restraint a form of resistance most people are too wounded to sustain, but she carried it like a blade wrapped in grace. But it wasn't just academia. In neighborhoods far from Capitol microphones, her name had become shorthand for standing firm. A middle school girl in Detroit, bullied for talking back in class, wrote in her journal, "I'm not rude, I'm just not small. I'm like her. I'm loud for justice." Her teacher found the note. She had it laminated. The reverberations weren't loud. They were deep. They moved not through media, but through memory, through the quiet moments where dignity is hardest to hold. Job interviews, parent-teacher conferences, courtroom benches. In those moments, Jasmine Crockett had become a reference point, a permission slip, a reminder that not shrinking isn't arrogance, it's survival. And Jasmine, she never pretended it didn't cost her something. In an interview weeks later, her first since the hearing, she sat across from a reporter who tried to get her to celebrate. "You've been called the embodiment of grace under fire," the journalist said. "Do you see it that way?" Jasmine smiled, but her eyes stayed still. "I wasn't trying to be graceful," she said. "I was trying not to give them a reason to erase me." She paused, then added, "The real story isn't that I kept my composure. The real story is why I had to." That quote made it into every major paper the next morning. But Jasmine didn't care, because for her, this was never about image. It was about space. Who gets to speak? Who gets believed? Who gets buried when the mic cuts off? And who refuses to let that silence win? And so she kept showing up, not louder, just unwavering, just present, because her voice didn't need to dominate every room anymore. It had already been heard, and more importantly, it had given others permission to speak their own. In the foyer of her district office, a new display had been quietly installed. Just one quote, framed above a waveform of the moment her voice was cut and then reclaimed. "I wasn't loud. You were just too used to me being silent." No plaque, no ribbon cutting, just the truth, left on the wall, where it would stay. But the legacy of that hearing wasn't just about headlines, hashtags, or even policy. It was about something quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. The human cost of being unheard and the power of refusing to stay that way. The lesson didn't come wrapped in applause. It came in the way Jasmine Crockett had to measure every breath she took behind a microphone that had already been tuned to distort her. It came in the way her voice was pre-labeled, too loud, too angry, too much, before she even opened her mouth. It came in the unspoken truth that her composure was never an accident, but a necessity. In a room built to shame her, she was expected not only to speak, but to survive the consequences of being heard. That isn't equality. That's a performance under pressure that most people never have to give. And yet, she gave it, because the deeper injustice wasn't just that Nancy Mace insulted her. It was that the room didn't collapse when it happened. It was that the moment wasn't shocking to many. It was familiar. For every woman of color who had ever been silenced in a boardroom, ignored in a courtroom, or punished in a classroom for tone rather than substance, this was not a unique wound. It was a mirror. A national reflection of the quiet violence woven into so-called professional spaces. And Jasmine's greatest act of rebellion? She didn't break. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't match insult with insult. Instead, she stood still while the system cracked open around her, and asked one unflinching question. "Say that again." For the record. In that moment, she forced the room to look at itself. No escape, no spin, no disassociation. She turned the table without flipping it. And that's what made it impossible to ignore, because she didn't fit the stereotype they'd prepared for. She refused to play the part they had written in advance. She didn't come to make noise. She came to make history. And through her restraint, she taught the rest of us something we rarely want to admit. That sometimes the most radical act in the face of injustice is not becoming the thing they expect you to be. The moral lesson here is not that Jasmine Crockett handled it well. That praise is too small for what she endured. The lesson is that no one should ever have to weaponize their own self-control in order to survive a space built for public service. The lesson is that racism, when disguised as professionalism, is no less violent. And that silence, when imposed on the marginalized, isn't neutrality, it's a muzzle. But Jasmine turned that muzzle into a mic, and she did so knowing the risks, that even a perfectly calm voice from a black woman can be twisted into a threat, that even undeniable evidence can be spun, that even in truth, she might not be protected. And still, she chose to speak. She chose not to dilute her presence, not to shrink to make others comfortable. And by doing so, she gave everyone watching something we are starved for in this country. A new model of strength. A strength that doesn't need volume to shake a room. A strength that knows the power of stillness, the discipline of holding your fire when the world hands you a match and begs for flames. A strength that doesn't prove itself through dominance, but through resistance to dehumanization. That is the lesson she left behind. Not just for black women, not just for politicians, but for all of us. For every person who's ever been talked over, dismissed, underestimated, or told to be quiet and wait your turn, Jasmine didn't just represent you. She reminded you that you never needed permission in the first place. She reminded you that truth doesn't have to shout to be heard. But when it does shout, when it must, it has every right to. Because this world doesn't change through politeness. It changes through courage disguised as grace, through accountability demanded without apology, through standing up, not just for yourself, but for the ones still afraid to. And if there's one moment, one phrase, one breath we take from what Jasmine gave us that day, it should be this. You called me loud. I call it not being silent anymore. That's not a comeback. That's a blueprint. And it's up to the rest of us to carry it forward. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In a high-stakes televised debate, Jasmine Crockett and Laura Ingraham collide over the future of immigration in America. One fighting for human dignity, the other defending border security. The heat intensifies as Crockett passionately defends millions of undocumented immigrants living in fear, while Ingraham pushes for draconian policies that could tear families apart. What follows is a public uproar, with Crockett winning massive support, while Ingraham's ratings crash. What explosive words did Jasmine say that sent shockwaves through the nation and changed everything? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera panned across the brightly lit studio, focusing on the two women who are about to clash on one of the most contentious issues in American politics. On one side sat Jasmine Crockett, the Democratic Congresswoman known for her unyielding stance on immigrant rights, and on the other side, Laura Ingraham, the conservative commentator whose fiery rhetoric often stirred controversy. The host's voice echoed through the studio as he set the stage for the debate, announcing, "Tonight, we have a special live broadcast. Two political heavyweights facing off on one of the most crucial topics of the moment, immigration reform." The atmosphere was electric, thick with anticipation. The host turned to Ingraham first, who began speaking with a steady, confident tone. But before the words could leave her mouth, the camera shifted to Crockett, her calm and collected expression making it clear she was ready for the battle ahead. The issue at hand was President Biden's newly proposed comprehensive immigration reform plan, which aimed to create a pathway to citizenship for millions of undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and the clash of ideologies was about to unfold live, with millions watching. The host, sensing the gravity of the moment, introduced the debate. Tonight, we witness a confrontation between two opposing views on the future of immigration in America. Will we uphold justice, or will we retreat into fear and division? With that, the stage was set for an intense, no-holds-barred debate. As the tension in the studio mounted, the camera zoomed in on Jasmine Crockett. Ingram's sharp words still hung in the air like a challenge, but Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned forward, her gaze unwavering, and in that moment, it felt like the entire room held its breath. With a calm yet commanding voice, she began her response, cutting through the heat of the debate. "Laura, with all due respect, you've missed the point entirely," she said, her words deliberate and powerful. Ingram's face tightened, but Crockett continued, her voice steady as she dismantled every claim made moments before. "This isn't about flooding our country with people who are here to take advantage. It's about recognizing the undeniable contributions that immigrants make to the backbone of this nation." Her eyes never left Ingram as she spoke, each sentence like a carefully aimed strike. Immigrants are not just workers, they are innovators, builders, creators. The very economy that supports our great nation would not stand without their labor. The weight of her words lingered in the air, the truth sinking in for those who were willing to listen. The room seemed to grow colder as Crockett pressed on, her voice growing more impassioned. "For too long, we've allowed fear and division to cloud our judgment. You talk about the dangers of immigration, but let me ask you, what about the danger of turning our backs on the people who are already here, who have already worked and struggled for a chance at the American dream?" She paused, letting the gravity of her statement settle over the crowd. "What about the dangers of denying asylum to those who flee violence, to the refugees who risk their lives to escape terror, only to be met with walls instead of the open arms that America once promised?" The host's eyes shifted nervously between the two, but Crockett wasn't done. "These people, these families are not the enemy. They are human beings seeking refuge, seeking hope in a country that has always stood for freedom. And yet you stand there, ready to turn them away. You speak of fairness, but what is fair about abandoning those who need us the most?" Her words were sharp, piercing the atmosphere like a blade. Ingram, unable to respond immediately, clenched her jaw, but Crockett was on a roll now. "Immigrants are not a threat. They are the lifeblood of this nation. You want to talk about national security? Our security comes from our ability to lead with compassion and strength, not fear and division. We can protect our borders and uphold the values that make America great. But you can't do that when you strip away the rights of those seeking refuge. That is the injustice we must confront, Laura. That is what you are perpetuating with every word you say." Her voice echoed through the studio, and for a brief moment, even Ingram was silent. The tension was thick, palpable, almost unbearable. But Crockett wasn't finished yet. She turned her gaze to the camera, as if speaking directly to the millions watching at home. "The truth is," she said, her voice softening, but carrying the weight of a generation's struggle, "America's greatness doesn't come from its walls. It comes from the hearts of its people, and it's time we remember that." The studio was silent for a beat, the tension hanging thick in the air, before Ingram's icy voice broke through. Her eyes locked onto Crockett, her lips curling into a determined sneer. "Jasmine," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dripping with disdain. "You can speak all you want about fairness and compassion, but let's talk about reality. What you're advocating for isn't justice, it's chaos." She paused for effect, the words settling like stones in the room. "These democratic policies you support aren't solutions. They're a direct threat to our national security, and they're a ticking time bomb for our social welfare system." Her words hit like a punch to the gut. The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the gravity of the conflict. Ingram continued, her voice rising. "You want open borders, but what you're forgetting is the impact of unchecked immigration. People are pouring in without the proper checks, creating a strain on our schools, our hospitals, and our economy. These policies don't protect the American people. They endanger them. You're weakening the very fabric of this nation." The studio seemed to vibrate with each of her pointed words. Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned forward slightly, her expression steady, but the fire in her eyes was undeniable. Ingram wasn't done, though. "You call it compassion," she snapped, "but how compassionate is it to ignore the reality that millions of people, many of them unvetted, are entering this country? How compassionate is it when American taxpayers are footing the bill for illegal immigration, for people who don't pay into the system?" Her words were fast, like daggers thrown with surgical precision. "I know you don't want to face it, but your open borders agenda is creating an unsustainable pressure on every aspect of our society." The studio seemed to hold its breath as Ingram continued her tirade, now visibly enraged, pacing slightly in her seat. "And don't talk to me about human rights," she shot back, her voice ice cold. "When you flood this country with people who don't belong here, you not only jeopardize our safety, but you also place an unbearable burden on our public services. Law-abiding citizens are the ones who suffer, Jasmine, the very citizens you claim to protect." Crockett's gaze didn't waver. "What's truly dangerous, Laura, is allowing fear and misinformation to dictate policy," she fired back, her voice firm but controlled. "You've spent so much time demonizing immigrants that you've lost sight of the truth. People seeking refuge aren't invaders. They are humans, fleeing violence and terror. You keep talking about economic strain, but let's talk about the human cost of denying asylum to those who need it most." Her words were measured, yet they carried an undeniable weight, cutting through the chaos in the room. The tension in the studio became palpable as both women locked eyes, neither willing to yield. Ingram's face tightened with frustration, but Crockett didn't back down. "You want to talk about safety? You want to talk about pressure on public services? How about the pressure you're putting on this country's moral integrity by treating immigrants like criminals?" Her voice grew louder, her intensity growing with every syllable. "You are perpetuating a lie, Laura, and it's hurting this country." The argument reached a fever pitch, the room crackling with energy as both women dug in their heels, the weight of their words hanging in the air like a final warning. Neither side was willing to concede an inch. Ingram shot back, "This is not a game, Jasmine. This is about protecting America, its people, its jobs, its future. You're playing politics, and in the process, you're sacrificing the very security this nation was built on." Crockett's voice rang out, powerful and unwavering. "And I will not sit idly by while you use fear to divide us. We are better than that, Laura." The debate raged on, both sides relentlessly clashing, with no sign of resolution in sight. The stakes had never been higher, and the battle over immigration reform was only just beginning. The air in the studio felt electric, the weight of the debate pressing down on everyone in the room. The tension was palpable as Ingram's forceful claims lingered in the air. But Crockett was calm, poised, determined not to let the narrative slip away. Leaning slightly forward, she locked eyes with Ingram, her voice unwavering as she began her counterpoint. "Laura," she began, her voice steady but cutting, "you continue to paint immigrants as a threat. But let's talk about facts, not fear-mongering. Let's talk about the real contributions immigrants make to this country. The contributions that are too often ignored or dismissed." The audience was silent, hanging on every word, as Crockett flipped through her notes. A moment later, the screen behind her flashed with statistics, bold and undeniable. "Did you know," she continued, "that immigrants represent over 17% of the workforce in America? They are integral in industries like agriculture, construction, and service sectors, sectors that keep this country moving forward." She paused for a moment, letting the numbers sink in, knowing that Ingram couldn't easily ignore them. "Immigrants aren't just laborers. They are essential to the very fabric of our economy. Without their work, entire industries would crumble." The room remained still, the sharp contrast between their perspectives clear. Ingram's eyes narrowed, the challenge now clear. She wasn't about to back down. "Really?" she shot back, her voice dripping with skepticism. "You want to talk about contributions? Let's talk about the costs. More and more people are entering this country without any regard for the rules. They aren't just workers. They are a strain on our resources. They overwhelm our schools, our hospitals, our welfare systems. This isn't about economics. It's about national survival. Crockett didn't flinch. That's the problem, Laura, she said, her voice calm but filled with conviction. You talk about costs, but you fail to see the true cost of your narrative. Immigrants, particularly those who've been here for years, paying taxes, raising families, contributing to society, they are not the problem. The problem is the fear and misinformation you're spreading. People like you are making it harder for those who already contribute to this country to be seen as anything more than a burden. The intensity in the studio spiked as Ingram responded sharply, "Fear. This is reality, Jasmine. We have terrorists, criminals, and cartels taking advantage of these policies. Unchecked immigration leaves us vulnerable. It makes us weak. The more we let in without any oversight, the more we risk becoming a nation that no longer controls its borders or its future." She pointed a finger toward Crockett, as if accusing her personally. "Your policy isn't humanitarian. It's dangerous." Crockett stood her ground, never losing her composure. "And yet, your dangerous rhetoric has led to policies that tear families apart. You talk about security, but where is the security in dividing families? In denying people the right to seek refuge and safety?" Her voice sharpened, taking on a deeper intensity. "You talk about crime, but here's the truth. Immigrants are actually less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Studies show that areas with higher immigration rates tend to have lower violent crime rates. The very narrative you're pushing is a lie, Laura." For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Ingram's expression shifted, her eyes flashing with frustration. She was stunned, but not yet beaten. "You can show all the statistics you want, but the reality is that unchecked immigration creates an environment where anything can happen, where bad actors can slip through the cracks and cause harm. You can't ignore the very real threat that people who have no intention of contributing to society are using these policies to their advantage." Crockett shook her head, her tone unwavering. "That's the false dichotomy you're presenting, Laura. Immigrants, regardless of their status, are not the enemy. They are people, human beings seeking a better life. They are not criminals. You speak of the fear of invasion, but you fail to acknowledge the human cost of what you're proposing. You want to shut down opportunities for these people, and for what? Because you're afraid of what you don't understand?" Her words were now like a call to arms, challenging Ingram and everyone listening. "We cannot continue to let fear dictate our policies. The real threat is not immigrants. The real threat is the fear-based policies that seek to divide us, that seek to make us forget who we are as a nation." Ingram, visibly shaken, leaned back, her eyes narrowing as she tried to regain control of the debate. But Crockett wasn't done. She finished with one last statement, her voice ringing out across the studio. "The true danger, Laura, is the dangerous rhetoric you spread, rhetoric that fuels division and hurts the very people who built this country. Immigrants are the backbone of America, and we can't afford to let people like you tear it down." The silence that followed was deafening. The intensity in the room was palpable. Both women holding their ground, the fate of the argument hanging in the balance. The debate had shifted, and the stakes had never been higher. The tension in the studio reached a boiling point. Ingram's words had struck hard, and for a moment the entire room seemed to pause, holding its breath. Crockett had laid out the facts with a quiet yet undeniable force. But now it was Ingram's turn to strike back, and she did so with a sharpness that cut through the growing intensity in the room. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a cold, calculating precision. "Jasmine," Ingram began, her voice thick with disdain, "you talk about compassion and justice, but your policies are nothing more than a fantasy. You want to open the doors wide, without regard for the consequences. This is idealism at its worst, completely divorced from the reality we face every day. You're so focused on your vision of what should be that you're ignoring what actually is." Her gaze locked on Crockett, and the words that followed felt like a personal attack. "This isn't just about compassion, it's about real security, real safety for American citizens. What you're advocating for puts everyone at risk. Unchecked immigration is a breeding ground for criminals, drug cartels, and potentially even terrorists." Her voice was sharp now, rising with each point she made. And what do we get in return for your utopian vision? A drain on our resources, overwhelmed schools, overcrowded hospitals, and the very real possibility that our national security will be compromised. These people aren't coming here to contribute. They're here to take advantage of a system that's already under strain. The room buzzed with the sharpness of her words, and for a brief moment, Ingram paused to let the weight of her statement settle. But Crockett, not missing a beat, shot back with a calm yet undeniable fury. She leaned forward in her chair, her posture tall and strong, as if every ounce of her being was ready to meet Ingram head-on. Her voice was steady, but it carried the force of someone who had spent years fighting for what she knew was right. "Laura," Crockett responded, her tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "You've spent so much time stirring up fear, so much time painting a picture of immigrants as criminals, that you've forgotten something. Immigrants, the people you're so quick to demonize, are not the threat. The real threat is the narrative you've built, the one that uses fear and division to push a political agenda. These people aren't criminals. They're human beings. They're mothers, they're fathers, they're workers, and they come here seeking safety, seeking opportunity." Ingram didn't back down, her face reddening with frustration. "You can call them whatever you want, Jasmine, but the facts speak for themselves. You want to open up the gates without any regard for the consequences. But the consequences are real, and they'll be felt by every American who has to foot the bill for your open border policies. You can't just ignore the strain it puts on the system. It's not just about humanitarian concerns. It's about the safety and well-being of Americans." Crockett shook her head slowly, her expression hardening. "What's truly dangerous, Laura, is your failure to see the truth. You keep hiding behind the false narrative of crime and terrorism. But the truth is, immigrants, especially those seeking asylum, are less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. Studies have shown that in areas with higher immigration, violent crime rates are lower than in areas with fewer immigrants. You're using fear to justify policies that harm innocent families, families who are just trying to survive, just trying to make a better life for themselves." Ingram's jaw clenched. She was visibly seething now, but Crockett didn't give her a chance to respond before she pressed on. "You want to talk about national security, Laura? Then let's talk about the real threat, the threat that comes from sowing division, from tearing families apart, from turning our backs on people who are literally running for their lives. That is what your policies are doing. You're feeding a system that dehumanizes people, that puts them in danger simply for seeking refuge." For a split second, the room fell silent. Ingram, for all her bluster, was momentarily at a loss for words. But then, she shot back, her voice filled with anger. "You can't just keep making excuses for people who are breaking the law, Jasmine. We cannot afford to prioritize the needs of those who aren't supposed to be here over the needs of American citizens." Crockett's response was immediate, her voice rising with the force of everything she had been fighting for. "What's the real cost here, Laura? The real cost is when we turn our backs on the very principles that make America what it is. The real cost is when we shut the door on people who are trying to escape violence, who are trying to find safety for their families. The real cost is when we forget that this nation was built on the backs of immigrants, immigrants who worked hard, who contributed to building the America we have today." The energy in the room was palpable now. Ingram's face was red with frustration, but Crockett wasn't backing down. She was on fire now, her passion and conviction filling every word. "And the real threat is when we allow fear to guide our policies, when we choose division over unity. The real threat, Laura, is letting rhetoric like yours destroy the very soul of this nation." The room was electric, each word exchanged in this fierce battle of ideologies, a reflection of the deeper, more personal stakes at play. Neither woman was willing to concede an inch. The debate had gone from a battle of policies to a battle for America's values, and there was no end in sight. The tension could have been cut with a knife, and the stakes were higher than they had ever been. The atmosphere in the studio shifted. The harshness of Ingram's rhetoric had filled the room, and the tension between her and Crockett was palpable. For a moment, Crockett sat in silence, eyes steady, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then, with a calm but undeniable purpose, she pressed a button on her tablet, signaling to the crew behind the scenes. The screen behind her flickered to life, and the audience fell into an expectant hush. Ingram shifted in her seat, a slight frown tugging at her lips as she realized what was about to happen. The video began to play. The footage showed immigrants, people from all corners of the globe, speaking directly to the camera. Their faces were filled with hope, determination, and strength. Each person shared their story of coming to America seeking a better life, a common dream, now realized. One man from El Salvador described how he had arrived as a young boy with nothing but the clothes on his back, only to build a successful career in tech. A woman from Mexico spoke about the small restaurant she had opened, now employing dozens of Americans and supporting her family. Another story followed, this time a woman from the Philippines who had started as a home health aide and worked her way up to a managerial position, providing jobs to others in her community. As the stories unfolded, Crockett remained calm and focused. She knew the power of these stories. They spoke for themselves. Each person in the video represented the very essence of the argument she had been making. Immigrants are not the criminals or the burden that some want to claim. They are the workers, the innovators, the dreamers, who contribute to the fabric of this nation every single day. They are not outsiders. They are part of the American story. When the video ended, the room was thick with silence. Ingram's confident, dismissive posture had faltered. For the first time in the debate, her eyes were not fixed on Crockett with challenge or scorn. Instead, there was a flicker of discomfort, a crack in her otherwise unyielding demeanor. She looked from the screen back to Crockett, but the words she had prepared to combat the video were suddenly far less certain. The silence was broken by Crockett, who didn't need to fill the space with words, but simply let the weight of the moment linger. These are just a few of the millions of immigrants who have come to this country and built something. They have worked hard, they have contributed, and they are as much a part of America as anyone who was born here. Her voice was calm, but it carried the force of a truth that could not be ignored. You can keep using your fear tactics, Laura, but these are the people who make America stronger every single day. Their stories are the true reality, not the fearful narrative you're trying to spread. Ingram, clearly rattled by the shift in the room's energy, struggled to regain her composure. Her fingers gripped the edge of the desk as she leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she began to speak. "Fine," she said, her voice sharp but noticeably lacking its previous bite. "You can show a few success stories, Jasmine, but they don't change the big picture. The real issue here is the uncontrolled influx of people into this country. You want to pretend that these success stories are the norm, but that's just not the reality." Ingram took a deep breath, trying to recover, but the cracks in her defense were now visible. "You can paint this as a simple humanitarian issue, but the truth is, this country cannot bear the cost of such wide-open immigration. The burden on the system, on social services, on schools, on healthcare, it's simply too great." But Crockett wasn't finished. She stood taller now, every word she spoke cutting through the haze of Ingram's deflections. "The real cost, Laura, is turning our backs on people who have nothing left but hope. The real danger is shutting the door on the very people who are fighting for a chance, who want to contribute and build their futures here, just like so many before them. What you're doing, what you're advocating, is not about safety or security. It's about fear. It's about creating division where there should be unity." Her voice, strong and steady, rang through the room. Ingram, for the first time in the debate, was at a loss for words. The video had hit hard, and no amount of rhetoric could easily undo the truth displayed before her. She took a moment, her lips pressing together tightly as she steeled herself for the next round. Her gaze flickered briefly toward the camera before shifting back to Crockett, but the confidence in her eyes had dimmed. The room had shifted. The audience, who had been silent but watching intensely, could feel the tension rise again. The real argument had now been framed, not in terms of fear or immigration rates, but in terms of the human cost of ignoring those who desperately needed America's protection. And in that moment, the true stakes of this debate became clear to everyone watching. The question was no longer about policies, it was about values, compassion, and the very soul of the country. Crockett had delivered a blow that wasn't just rhetorical, it was real, undeniable, and human. And now the pressure was on Ingram to respond. Would she retreat into the same tired arguments, or would she finally confront the truth that Crockett had laid bare? The debate was far from over, but the course had been set, and Ingram was facing a turning point she hadn't anticipated. The studio had become a battleground of words, and the air was thick with the weight of every sentence. Ingram's attack on the current immigration system hung heavily in the room, but Crockett wasn't going to let the conversation devolve into fear-mongering and divisiveness. She listened intently as Ingram finished, then leaned forward slightly, her face calm, but her eyes hardening with resolve. "Laura," she began, her voice firm but measured, "you talk about a broken immigration system, one that you say is letting in people who aren't contributing, who aren't following the rules. But let me tell you something. This system may be flawed, but it's not the immigrants who are the problem. It's the system itself that's failing, not the people who are seeking a better life." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the audience. The silence was almost deafening, but she wasn't finished. "Your idea of a better system is nothing more than a gatekeeper, designed to keep the most vulnerable out, under the guise of economic benefit. It's about keeping the status quo, not recognizing the human beings that make this country thrive." She took a deep breath, her voice rising with more passion. "The truth is, immigrants, both documented and undocumented, are part of the foundation of this country. They work hard, they build businesses, they contribute to our communities in ways that you can't measure with a paycheck or an employment form. Immigrants aren't a burden on this country, they're a lifeblood, especially in industries like agriculture, construction, and service, the ones that keep our economy moving. And yet you stand here calling for a system that privileges the rich, the powerful, the already established. How does that fit with the values we claim to hold as a nation?" There was a shift in the air, a palpable tension as Crockett continued. "You want to create a system that only lets in people who can contribute financially. You want a system that makes immigrants feel like they have to prove their worth before they're allowed to be a part of this country. But what about the refugees? What about the families fleeing violence, fleeing oppression, fleeing death? What about their worth? What about their humanity?" Her words were sharp, but they were filled with a deep, aching truth. Ingram didn't flinch, but her expression hardened. She had clearly anticipated Crockett's rebuttal, but the force of her words was undeniable. Still, Ingram was resolute. She leaned forward, locking eyes with Crockett, her voice turning cold and steady. "Jasmine, you can't ignore the reality. The current system is broken, and you want to make it even looser. The problem is that we are facing a crisis. Immigration isn't just about helping people. It's about the impact on American citizens, on their jobs, on their safety, and on the future of this country." Her voice grew more intense. "We have to prioritize America's interests. It's not about compassion, it's about national security. The more people we let in without proper vetting, the greater the risk we face. We are inviting criminals, drug cartels, and potential terrorists to exploit our system. And for what? A false sense of humanitarianism that puts everyone else at risk?" Crockett's eyes flashed with anger, but she remained calm, refusing to let Ingram's words shake her. "And there it is, Laura. There's the real threat, not the immigrants, but the fear you're feeding. You're demonizing people who are running for their lives, who are coming here to escape the very same dangers you claim to be afraid of. But what you don't understand is that America's strength isn't in shutting its doors. It's in its ability to welcome people in need. You're telling us to shut the door to people who deserve a chance at life just because they don't meet your idea of what's economically useful." Her voice dropped, becoming softer but no less determined. "America is not a business, Laura. It's a country built on the principle of freedom and compassion. Our immigration policy should reflect that, not the idea that people are only valuable if they fit into a narrow economic mold. We need a system that evaluates people based on their humanity, not just their potential to contribute financially. Refugees, asylum seekers, and those fleeing persecution have a right to seek safety here, and it's our moral obligation to help them." There was a brief pause, the studio now hanging on Crockett's words. She had shifted the debate, moved it beyond the confines of economics, and into something far more fundamental. Ingram's expression flickered with frustration, her lips tightening as she tried to form a response. But it was clear that Crockett had landed a critical blow. In the end, Laura, Crockett continued, her voice unwavering, our immigration system needs to be smart, but also just. It needs to recognize the value of people, not just their potential to pay taxes, but their right to live. We cannot continue to exclude those who have nothing but the hope of a better life. The moral failure would be in shutting them out, not in letting them in. The room was still, the weight of her words hanging heavy in the air. Ingram was visibly flustered now, but her defense was no longer as sharp as before. The facts were on the table, and the debate had shifted from politics to ethics, from fear to compassion. It was clear that Crockett was fighting not just for a policy, but for something much more profound, the soul of a nation. The debate had reached a boiling point, the tension in the room palpable as both women stood their ground. Ingram, her face flushed with frustration, had just finished attacking Crockett's immigration reform proposal, accusing her of ignoring the very real dangers of unchecked immigration. The sharpness of her words echoed in the studio, but Crockett remained calm, her gaze unwavering. She knew what was at stake, and she wasn't about to let her opponent's rhetoric define the conversation. Without hesitation, Crockett spoke, her voice steady but powerful. Laura, you've made it clear that you think immigrants are a threat, an economic burden, a security risk. But what you fail to see is that the system itself is broken. It's not the immigrants who are the problem. It's the system that has been designed to keep them out, to dehumanize them, and to treat them as second-class citizens. Her words were deliberate, each one landing with precision. The truth is, our current immigration system doesn't serve anyone. Not the immigrants, not the American citizens, and certainly not the nation as a whole. What we need is a system that is fair, humane, and effective. She paused for a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle, her eyes fixed on Ingram. We need a system that allows deserving individuals to build a future in this country, one that doesn't just prioritize financial gain, but also considers the human dignity of each person seeking a better life. We cannot turn away people simply because they don't meet some narrow economic standard. The true measure of this country's greatness is how we treat the most vulnerable among us. The audience, silent and absorbed, hung on every word. Crockett had shifted the debate, not just arguing for policy changes, but making a moral case for the future of the nation. She wasn't just speaking about statistics or political ideals. She was talking about values, the very essence of what America stood for. She continued, her voice growing more impassioned. We need to end the criminalization of immigrants and instead focus on reform that respects their human rights. Because when we fail to do so, we lose what it means to be American. Compassion is not a weakness. It is our greatest strength. Ingram's expression hardened as Crockett spoke. She was visibly frustrated, and it was clear that Crockett had touched a nerve. Ingram was used to playing on fear, to painting immigrants as the enemy. But now she could see that the debate was moving beyond fear and into the realm of values. With a quick inhale, Ingram shot back, her voice dripping with condescension. Jasmine, you keep talking about compassion and humanity, but let's get back to reality. What you're proposing isn't reform. It's a disaster. It's irresponsible. You want to open our borders, give amnesty to millions, and reward people who have violated our laws. What does that say about the integrity of our nation? Her voice grew more intense, fueled by frustration. You're so caught up in this idealistic vision that you're completely ignoring the security risks, the criminal elements that exploit our broken system. Your plan will only create more chaos, more danger, and more lawlessness. This is the reality, Jasmine. The room was thick with tension as Ingram finished her tirade. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes daring Crockett to respond. But Crockett wasn't rattled. She was steady, unflinching, her voice cutting through the rising intensity. That's the problem, Laura, she said, her words deliberate and clear. You keep demonizing immigrants, portraying them as criminals, as threats to national security. But the real threat is not the people fleeing violence, the families seeking a better future. The real threat is the fear you're sowing. The real danger is turning people into scapegoats to distract from the true issues we face as a country. She leaned in slightly, her voice gaining momentum. Your vision for immigration reform isn't about solving problems. It's about perpetuating fear. Fear of the other, fear of change, fear of those who are different. And what you're failing to understand is that America has always been a nation of immigrants. We were built on the backs of those who came here seeking something better, who fought for their place in this country, who contributed to the strength and diversity of the nation. Crockett paused for a moment, letting the truth of her words settle in. What we need is not more division, but more understanding. We need a system that values people for who they are, not just their economic worth. We need to be the nation that welcomes the weary, the oppressed, and the vulnerable. That is what America stands for. And if we don't embrace that, then we are no longer the country that I believe in. The room was silent. The weight of the exchange hung in the air, thick and undeniable. The audience could feel the shift. It was no longer just a debate about policy, but about the soul of the nation. Ingram, clearly rattled, tried to gather her thoughts, but her response came out halting and strained. I don't think you understand, Jasmine, she muttered, but her voice lacked the usual conviction. You're asking for a system that just isn't realistic. It's too much. It's too dangerous. Crockett looked at her, unyielding, her voice soft but full of power. What's dangerous, Laura, is to turn away from humanity. What's dangerous is to create a system that only sees people as numbers, as liabilities, as threats. We cannot afford to let fear guide us. Not now, not ever. The room was still, the energy thick, as the two women locked eyes, each holding her ground. The debate had reached a crossroads. Crockett had successfully shifted the conversation from fear-driven rhetoric to the true essence of the issue: human dignity. Ingram was visibly shaken, but she wasn't ready to concede yet. This was far from over. The real fight was just beginning. The studio buzzed with tension, the heavy air crackling with the weight of the debate. Crockett had just delivered a powerful personal story, a story of immigrant success, of lives transformed through grit and hard work. But now it was time for Ingram to respond, and her eyes narrowed with renewed intensity, clearly unimpressed by the emotional appeal. She leaned forward in her chair, her expression cold and calculated, ready to take the stage again. That's a touching story, Jasmine, she began, her voice smooth but sharp. But let's be real. Stories like the Ramirez family are exceptions, not the rule. You can't base national policy on a handful of success stories. The truth is that most immigrants who come here, especially illegally, don't become entrepreneurs or doctors. They don't open businesses or contribute to society. They place an enormous burden on our public services and our economy. And that cost is something that American taxpayers, who are already struggling, have to bear. Her words hit with the force of a blow, and the audience reacted with a quiet murmur, some nodding in agreement. Ingram's tone was now a mix of confidence and frustration as she pressed her point. What's happening here isn't about compassion, Jasmine. It's about reality. Our country cannot afford to open its doors to everyone who wants to come here. The system is overwhelmed. Illegal immigration has created a crisis, one that threatens the safety, the jobs, and the resources of American citizens. Your policies will only exacerbate the problem, leading to more people coming here without the legal ability to stay, more strain on our hospitals, more children in overcrowded classrooms, and more crime. The accusation hung in the air like a sharp knife, but Crockett was ready. She had heard these talking points before, and she wasn't about to let them define the conversation. Ingram wasn't just attacking a policy, she was attacking the humanity of those who had already suffered and sacrificed for a chance at a better life. With unwavering resolve, Crockett spoke, her voice steady and filled with the kind of calm that only came from knowing she was right. The real cost, Laura, is not the families who come here with nothing but hope in their hearts. The real cost is when we let fear and division dictate who is allowed to live in this country. The real cost is when we turn away those who are desperately fleeing violence, persecution, and death. You talk about the burden on American taxpayers, but what about the burden of turning our backs on the people who need us most? The studio fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Crockett didn't let up. We're not talking about numbers or statistics, Laura. We're talking about people, real people. Jose and Maria Ramirez didn't come to this country to take. They came to build. And they are not the exception. They are the rule. They are the future of America. When we close our hearts to those who need our help, we turn away from the very values that make this country great. She paused, letting the room absorb her words before continuing. What you're offering is a closed door, a door that shuts out the very people who have the potential to be part of the fabric of this nation. Your immigration reform, it isn't about security, Laura. It's about division. It's about fear. It's about keeping people out who have the courage to seek a better life, who have the willingness to contribute, to work hard, to build something with their own hands. You want to make them criminals, but they're not criminals. They're just people looking for a chance that America should be willing to give. Ingram's lips tightened, her frustration palpable. But Crockett wasn't finished. She stood taller, her body language radiating confidence and determination. And Laura, you're right about one thing. We can't afford to ignore the costs, but we can't afford to ignore the human cost of what your policies would do to families like the Ramirez's. The cost of breaking up families, the cost of sending children back to countries where they face danger, where they face violence, where they have no future. The studio grew quieter still as Crockett let her final point land. The real danger is not the people who come here seeking refuge, seeking opportunity. The real danger is the policies that ignore the humanity of those people. The real danger is building a wall around our hearts instead of one around our borders. The room held its breath, the audience clearly moved by Crockett's unwavering stance. But Ingram, not one to back down, quickly shot back, her voice brimming with anger. This is not about humanity, Jasmine. This is about keeping our nation secure. It's about protecting the American people from those who are coming here without regard for the law. Your vision is unrealistic. It puts everyone at risk, and the consequences will be disastrous. Her words echoed in the room, but this time Crockett was ready. And what's the cost of turning away those who have no other place to go? What's the cost of closing our hearts when the world needs us most? I'll tell you what the cost is. It's the soul of this nation. The debate was no longer just about immigration. It was a battle over values, over compassion, over what kind of America they both believed in. As Ingram tried to find her footing again, Crockett had already shifted the conversation, reframing it as a matter of human dignity and moral responsibility. Neither woman was willing to give up, but in that moment, the stakes had never been higher. The audience could feel it, the palpable clash between fear and hope, between a vision of America as a fortress and one as a refuge for those in need. The debate had escalated, and now the fight was about something much bigger than policies. It was about the future of the nation. As the debate ended, the aftermath unfolded rapidly. The tension in the studio was palpable, but the real battleground was not in the room. It was in the hearts and minds of the millions watching across the country. Jasmine Crockett had made her case, not just through facts and figures, but through the human stories that she shared. Her unwavering stance on immigration reform had struck a chord with many, and as the broadcast came to a close, the reactions began to pour in. In the hours that followed, social media exploded with commentary. Hashtags like Rivalry, Justice for Immigrants, and Crockett for Change began trending as people from all walks of life rallied behind her message. Her words had been powerful, but it was the personal connection she had made with viewers that turned the tide. Videos of her sharp yet compassionate defense of immigration reform circulated widely, shared by those who had felt a shift in their own thinking. The narrative had changed, and the force behind it was undeniable. The public began to recognize that Crockett wasn't just advocating for a policy, she was advocating for values. Her message was about dignity, compassion, and moral responsibility, values that transcended the economic arguments often used to limit immigration. The tide of public opinion, once dominated by fear-driven rhetoric, had shifted in her favor. Meanwhile, Ingram could feel the ground beneath her slipping. Her response to Crockett had been rooted in fear, in warnings of threats to national security and the potential economic burden of immigration. But those arguments had been sharply challenged by the human stories Crockett had shared, and the public wasn't buying it anymore. Ingram had always prided herself on being the voice of reason for many conservative viewers, the one who spoke truth to power. But now her arguments were met with an increasing backlash. The audience that had once been her loyal following was now splintering. A new narrative was rising, one that demanded compassion over division. As the debate over immigration policy continued to rage, Ingram's show saw a marked decline in viewership. The statistics were telling. Ratings, once strong, were now beginning to wane, as more and more viewers were tuning out. The audience was shifting toward those who were speaking for a more inclusive, humane future. The damage didn't stop with lost ratings. Ingram was now facing the consequences of her own rhetoric. Major advertisers began to pull their support from her program, hesitant to be associated with the increasingly controversial views she espoused. Brands that had once found comfort in her platform were now retreating, worried about the growing public disapproval. It wasn't just the numbers that were dwindling, it was the public trust in her message. As Ingram watched her empire begin to erode, she found herself at a crossroads. She had built her platform by appealing to the fear of those who felt their way of life was being threatened. But Crockett had shown the country a new path, one where humanity and justice took precedence over fear. Meanwhile, Crockett's message was only gaining momentum. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She had become a movement, a symbol of the fight for immigrant rights and social justice. Her message had resonated not just with the left, but with a wide spectrum of people who were tired of division and wanted to see a country that truly embraced its ideals of compassion. Her social media was flooded with messages of support from people who had never seen the debate about immigration in such human terms before. By contrast, Ingram was left struggling to reassert her influence, her once unshakable confidence now chipped away. The backlash had been swift and overwhelming. The same voices that had cheered her on in the past were now questioning the logic of her fear-driven rhetoric. She found herself on the defensive, unable to regain the momentum she once had. It was clear. The landscape had changed. Crockett had done more than win a debate. She had changed the conversation, and the nation was beginning to listen. The future of immigration policy was no longer just about border security. It was about humanity, about valuing people, not just their economic contributions. And in this fight, it was clear who was emerging as the new voice of America's conscience. The shift was unmistakable, and the moral high ground had found a new champion in Crockett. She was no longer just a politician. She was a symbol of the progressive future many were now clamoring for, a future that embraced immigrants, fought for justice, and challenged the status quo. As Ingram's influence began to fade, Crockett was only growing stronger with the American people, and the conversation shifting toward her vision for a more inclusive, just society. As the debate concluded, the ripples of its impact spread far beyond the confines of the studio. The tension that had simmered throughout the exchange between Jasmine Crockett and Laura Ingram still lingered in the air, but now the focus shifted to what came after. The words Crockett had spoken resonated deeply with the millions watching at home. Ingram's sharp attacks had been met with calm, reasoned responses, but it was Crockett's call for compassion and human dignity that struck a chord in the hearts of the public. Within hours, the landscape of the conversation had shifted entirely. The reaction from the audience was immediate. Social media exploded in a wave of tweets, posts, and hashtags, with number "Justice for Immigrants" trending on Twitter. The viral clips of Crockett's passionate defense of immigrant rights spread like wildfire across the internet, viewed by millions of people who hadn't been exposed to the conversation before. Crockett had done more than just argue her case. She had made people feel. The human stories she shared, the stories of families who had come to America seeking nothing more than a chance at a better life, had cut through the noise of fear and rhetoric that had dominated the discussion. For the first time, it seemed that America was hearing the voices of those who had been silenced for so long. Major civil rights organizations like the ACLU and Human Rights Watch quickly issued statements praising Crockett for her leadership and courage. They hailed her as a true champion of immigrant rights, someone who had the strength to stand up against the fear-mongering that had long shaped the national conversation on immigration. But it wasn't just the advocacy groups that took notice. Political figures from across the spectrum, Even those who had previously opposed comprehensive immigration reform began to express admiration for Crockett's unwavering commitment to justice. She had made the issue not about political gain or party lines, but about the moral responsibility to protect those who needed it most. As the public's response grew, the tide began to turn in Crockett's favor. The momentum was undeniable. The conversations on news networks shifted, with more and more reporters and commentators acknowledging the human element of the immigration debate, something that Crockett had so forcefully brought to the forefront. She wasn't just another politician. She had become a voice for the voiceless, a symbol of hope for those whose stories had been drowned out by political rhetoric. Meanwhile, Ingram, who had once seemed so confident in her ability to control the narrative, found herself on the defensive. The backlash against her arguments came quickly. Viewers began to turn away from her show, frustrated by the narrow, fear-driven viewpoint she had espoused. Ratings for her program, once solid, began to decline steadily. More importantly, the tone of the conversation had begun to shift, and Ingram's rhetoric seemed out of touch with a nation that was beginning to demand more from its leaders. Advertisers who had supported her show started pulling back, unwilling to be associated with the controversial views that were now drawing widespread criticism. Ingram was not used to this kind of pushback. For years, she had cultivated a loyal following by leveraging fear and division. But now, in the face of Crockett's rationality, compassion, and moral clarity, her once unshakable position was cracking. The public no longer saw her as a voice of reason. They saw her as part of the problem, part of the divide that was tearing at the fabric of the nation. On the other hand, Crockett was only gaining momentum. Grassroots organizations from all over the country began organizing in support of her policies, rallying behind her call for comprehensive reform. Activists took to the streets, organizing rallies and marches in cities from coast to coast, demanding a change in the nation's immigration system. Crockett's voice had become a rallying cry for those who had been denied a seat at the table, for the undocumented, the refugees, and the families whose futures were being torn apart by an inequitable system. Her name was now synonymous with hope, hope for a better, more inclusive America. She wasn't just challenging the status quo. She was offering a new vision of what the country could be if it chose to act with justice and humanity. As Ingram's show began to lose advertisers and viewers, Crockett's following grew. She was embraced by political groups and activists who had long been pushing for change, and they saw in her the possibility of a future where immigration was treated not as a problem, but as a part of the solution to the nation's growth and vitality. By the end of the week, Crockett had achieved something that seemed impossible just days before. She had shifted the conversation. She had not just won the debate, she had redefined the terms of the debate. Her message of justice for immigrants was not just a policy, it was a moral imperative that could no longer be ignored. In the process, she had inspired countless Americans, people from all walks of life, who now saw the immigration issue as one that touched the core of the country's values. As the support for Crockett continued to grow, Ingram's influence began to wane. The media was beginning to turn its focus away from her divisive narrative and toward the hopeful, inclusive message that Crockett had championed. Her voice, once so dominant in conservative circles, was now being drowned out by a movement that demanded a future built on compassion and human dignity. And while the fight for immigration reform was far from over, Crockett had already won a significant victory, not just for herself, but for the countless people who had been waiting for someone to stand up for them. She had not only challenged the narrative, she had transformed it. Her message had resonated with a country that was ready for change, and in that moment, Crockett had become more than a politician. She had become a symbol of the future, a future that was finally ready to embrace the values it was founded upon. The weight of the debate had settled into the room, but Crockett wasn't finished. She knew that the conversation could no longer stay within the walls of the studio. It had to extend far beyond the cameras, into the hearts and minds of every American who was watching, listening, and, most importantly, feeling. With the microphone in hand, she took a deep breath, and the energy in the room shifted. It was no longer just a political debate, it was a call to action. "This isn't just about immigration," Crockett began, her voice calm but laden with the urgency of what was at stake. This is about who we are as a country. We are at a crossroads, and the decision we make today will echo in the generations to come. Her eyes scanned the room, but it felt as though she were speaking directly to the millions of people watching at home. For too long, fear and division have shaped our decisions. For too long, we've allowed racism, hate, and intolerance to guide us when it should be love, justice, and compassion. We cannot let that continue. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of the silence settle in. Then with conviction, she continued, I am asking every one of you, no matter where you come from, no matter what your political beliefs are, no matter your race or background, to stand up. Stand up for those who have no voice, for those who have been left behind, for those who seek refuge, safety, and a better life in the land of the free. Crockett's voice grew stronger with every word. Immigration reform isn't just a policy, it's a moral issue. It's about human dignity. It's about respecting the basic rights of every individual who walks through our doors, who works hard to contribute to this nation, who raises their children to believe in the American dream. Her words rang with purpose, and the room seemed to lean in closer, as if each person was holding their breath, waiting for what she would say next. You've seen the faces of immigrants, mothers, fathers, children, workers, students. These are the people who make this country great. These are the families who come here not to take, but to give, to contribute their sweat, their talent, their hearts to the land that promised them a better life. And yet for too long, they've been demonized, pushed aside, and forced to live in the shadows. Her eyes hardened, the steel of her resolve apparent. We cannot let fear guide us any longer. We cannot continue to allow politicians, pundits, and media outlets to stoke the flames of division and hate. It's time to choose humanity over fear, justice over division. It's time to stand up against racism, to stand up for the rights of every immigrant who seeks a chance at a better future. The weight of the words hung in the air, and Crockett took a moment to breathe, letting the full weight of what she had just said settle in. The American dream isn't just for the privileged few. It's for everyone who dares to hope, to work, and to believe in the possibilities of a better tomorrow. And we, all of us, must protect that dream. It's not just our duty, it's our moral imperative. She stepped forward, her voice strong and clear. I am calling on you to stand up, to raise your voice, to demand that the government protect human dignity, to protect the rights of immigrants, and to create a system that reflects the best of who we are as a nation. Stand up for compassion. Stand up for justice. Stand up for those who can't speak for themselves. Don't let fear and hatred define who we are. Let love, understanding, and justice be the guiding forces of our nation. The room erupted into applause, but Crockett wasn't finished. She raised her hand, calling for silence, allowing her final words to settle deeply in everyone's hearts. This is our moment, our chance to right the wrongs, to build a future where all people are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. We cannot afford to wait. This fight isn't just for today, it's for tomorrow. For our children, for our grandchildren, for the generations that will look back and ask, what did we do? We cannot fail them. We must act now. With that, she stepped back, her chest rising and falling with the weight of what she had just said. The words hung in the air like a challenge, a demand for action. It was a call to arms, a plea for justice that was impossible to ignore. Crockett had laid down the gauntlet, and the world had no choice but to respond. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.